The Primitive and the Professional by John Berger. Art historically. The word primitive has been used in three different ways. To designate art before Raphael, on the borderline between the medieval and the modern Renaissance traditions. To label the trophies and curiosities taken from the colonies, Africa, the Caribbean, the South Pacific, when brought back to the imperial metropolis. And lastly, to put in its place the art of men and women from the working classes. Proletarian, peasant, petty bourgeoisie, who did not leave their class by becoming professional artists. According to all three usages of the word primitive, originating in the last century when the confidence of the European ruling class was at its height, the superiority of the main European tradition of secular art serving the same civilized ruling class was assured. Most professional artists begin their training when young. Most primitive artists of the third category come to painting or sculpture in middle or even in old age. Their art usually derives from considerable personal experience, and indeed is often provoked as a result of the profundity or intensity of that experience. Yet, artistically, their art is seen as naive, that is, inexperienced. It is the significance of this contradiction that we need to understand. Does it actually exist? And if so, what does it mean? To talk of the dedication of the primitive artist, his patience, his application amounting to a kind of skill, does not altogether answer this question. The primitive is defined as the non-professional, the category of the professional artist as distinct from the master craftsman. It was not clear until the 17th century, and in some places, especially in Eastern Europe, not until the 19th century. The distinction between profession and craft is at first a difficult one to make, and yet it is of great importance. The craftsman survives so long as the standards for judging his work are shared by different classes. The professional appears when it is necessary for the craftsman to leave his class and to emigrate to the ruling class, whose standards of judgment are different. The relationship of the professional artist to the class that ruled or aspired to rule was a complicated one, and various, and it should not be simplified. His training, however, and it was his training that made him a professional, taught him a set of conventional skills. That is to say, he became skilled in using a certain set of conventions of composition, of drawing, perspective, chiaroscuro, anatomy, poses, symbolism. And these conventions corresponded so closely to the social experience, or at least the social manners, of the class he was serving, that they were not even seen as conventions, but were thought of as the only way of recording and preserving these eternal truths. Yet to the other social classes, such professional painting appeared to be so remote from their own experience that they saw it as a mere social convention, a mere accoutrement of the class that had ruled over them, which is why, in moments of revolt, painting and sculpture were often destroyed. During the 19th century, certain artists, for consciously social or political reasons, had tried to extend the professional tradition of painting so that it might express the experience of other classes. For example, Millet, Courbet, Van Gogh. Their personal struggles, their failures, and the opposition that they were met with were a measure of the enormity of this undertaking. Perhaps one pedestrian example will give some idea of the extent of the difficulties involved. Consider Ford Madox Brown's well-known painting of Work. It shows a team of navvies with passers-by and bystanders working on a sidewalk. It took the painter 10 years to complete, and it is, at one level, extremely accurate. But it looks like a religious scene, the mounting of the cross or the calling of the disciples. One searches for the figure of Christ in it. Some would argue that this is because the artist's attitude to his subject was ambivalent. I would argue that the optic of all the visual means he was using with such care preempted the possibility of depicting manual work as the main subject of the painting in any but a mythological or a symbolic way. The crisis provoked by those who tried to extend the area of experience to which painting might be open, and by the end of the century, this also included the Impressionists, continuing into the 20th century. But its terms were reversed. The tradition was indeed dismantled, yet except for the introduction of the unconscious, the area of experience from which most European artists drew remained surprisingly unchanged. Consequently, most of the serious art of the period dealt either with the experience of various kinds of isolation or with the narrow experience of painting itself. The latter produced painting about painting, or abstract art. One of the reasons why the potential freedom gained by the dismantling of the tradition was not used may be to do with the way painters were still being trained. In the academies and art schools, they first learned those very conventions which were being dismantled. Now recently, corporate capitalism, having grounds to believe itself triumphant, has begun to adopt abstract art. And the adoption is proving rather easy. Diagrams of aesthetic power lend themselves to becoming emblems of economic power. In the process, almost all lived experience has been eliminated from the image. And thus, the extreme of abstract art demonstrates, as an epilogue, the original problematic of professional art. An art, in reality, concerned with a selective but reduced area of experience, which nevertheless claims to be universal. Something like this overview of traditional art, and the overview is, of course, only partial. There are other things to be said on other occasions, but it may help us to answer the questions about primitive art. The first primitive artists appeared during the second half of the 19th century. They appeared after professional art had first questioned its own conventional purposes. The notorious Salon des Refus was held in 1863. This exhibition was not, of course, the reason for their appearance. What helped to make their appearance possible were universal primary education, paper, pencils, ink, the spread of popular journalism, a new geographical mobility due to the railways, and the stimulus of clearer class consciousness. Perhaps also the example of the Bohemian professional artists had its effect. The Bohemian chose to live in a way that defied normal class divisions, and his lifestyle, if not his work, tended to suggest that art could come from any class. They were treated as cultural sports, not because of their class origin, but because they refused or were ignorant of the fact that all artistic expression is traditionally to undergo a class transformation. In this way, they were quite distinct from amateurs. Most, but not all, of those whom came from cultured classes, amateurs by definition, followed with less rigor, the example of the professionals. The primitive begins alone. He inherits no practice. Because of this, the term primitive may appear at first to be a justified one. He does not use the pictorial grammar of the tradition, hence he is ungrammatical. He has not learned the technical skills which have evolved with the conventions, and hence he is clumsy. When he discovers on his own a solution to a pictorial problem, he often uses it many times, and hence he is naive. But then one has to ask, why does he refuse the tradition? And the answer is only partly that he was born far away from that tradition. For the effort necessary to begin painting or sculpting, in the social context in which he finds himself, it is so great that it could well include visiting the museums, but it never does, at least at the beginning. And why? Because he knows already that his own lived experience, which is forcing him to make art, it has no place in that tradition. How does he know this without having visited museums? Well, he knows it because his own experience is one of being excluded from the exercise of power in his society. And he realizes from the compulsion he now feels that art too has a kind of power. The will of primitives derives from faith in their own experience and a profound skepticism about society as they have found it. This is true even of such an amiable artist as Grandma Moses. I hope I have made clear why the clumsiness of primitive art is the precondition for its very eloquence. What it is saying could never be said with any ready-made skills. What it is saying was never meant, according to the cultural class system, to be said.